bring you the breaking news this evening that a Conservative MP has defected to the Labour Party, only the third defection since 2019. There was Christian Wakeford, who defected to Labour from the Conservatives. Then there was Lee Anderson, more recently, who defected to the Reform Party. Now, Dr Dan Poulter, the MP for Central Suffolk and North Ipswich, has defected from the Tories to the Labour Party. So we're going to have all of that parliamentary pantomime on Monday when Dr Dan Poulter will cross the floor of the House from the Conservative benches to the Labour benches and give Keir Starmer a moment in the sun. Of course, it's a great moment for him, and he is already celebrating on Twitter. A dreadful moment for Rishi Sunak just ahead of the local elections. Do you think this is the beginning of the end for Rishi Sunak? We said that before, of course. There were questions around whether the defection of Lee Anderson would topple the Prime Minister. It didn't. But there is particular pressure this week around the local elections. There has already been speculation that maybe Conservative MPs might start putting letters in following those local elections if they are indeed as disastrous for Rishi Sunak as we anticipate they will be. And a defection on top of those local election results, is that something that Rishi Sunak can survive? Do you think it's now time for him to throw in the towel, to admit defeat, given the polls, given the divisions within his party? Is there any point in him carrying on as Prime Minister? Or do you think that, yet again, Rishi Sunak is just being underestimated here and that actually he will continue until the next election and maybe the polls will be defied and he won't do quite as badly as everyone anticipates? 0345 6060 973. What should happen to Rishi Sunak following this latest defection? Let's get the view now of Andrew Fisher, who's a political advisor and researcher, writer and trade unionist. He served as Director of Policy of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. Good evening to you, Andrew.
Good evening.
Thanks for joining me at short notice to react to this breaking news. How significant do you think this defection will be?
I mean, it's clearly very damaging for the Conservatives. It's not just the fact he has defected, it's what he said while he's defected. He said he could no longer, and this is a guy who's a mental health doctor as well as an MP. He said he could no longer, or found it increasingly hard to look patients, NHS colleagues and his constituents in the eye, given the state of the NHS. He called the Conservative Party a nationalist party of the right, clearly a dig at all the focus on Rwanda rather than on the actual issues that are facing Britain, the cost of living crisis, the state of the NHS, got record NHS backlogs as well. So I think that combination, and obviously Rishi Sunak's speech about a sick note culture, where he really attacked people on mental health who are on benefits, again, is probably what's tipped him over the edge here. So I think as much as the defection itself is obviously damaging, I think it's the nature of it, it's the criticism, because it chimes with what a lot of Conservative voters have thought, which is, actually, I don't want to vote for them anymore. And you see that in the polls, you've seen it in the by-elections, and I think we're going to see it next Thursday.
And Keir Starmer is really sort of emphasising that this means that Labour is a changed party. He says that. He says it's fantastic to welcome Dr Dan Poulter MP to today's changed Labour Party. Do you accept that a defection like this would have been very unlikely under Jeremy Corbyn, and that Keir Starmer does deserve some credit here, probably, as he certainly thinks so, for having taken the party in a different direction?
I don't think he necessarily deserves credit. I think it's clear that Conservatives would be much less likely to defect to a party that is more ideologically socialist and stood for more principled things. The fact that the Labour Party is less ideologically clear, in fact less clear on policy in general, I think does make it easier for people who are on the centre right, like Dan Poulter, on the kind of left of the Conservative Party, I suppose, to move over, because there's not a lot of difference. If you were a kind of true believer in the Cameronite vision, not that it was ever delivered, but of that kind of more liberal Conservative nature, actually, there's nothing in Labour's current programme that should scare him, really. So, yes, I guess that's true. But I think the issue is he's not going to stand for Labour at the next election. He said he's going to stand down. So This is really just a bit of a dig at Rishi Sunak for the next probably 3-4 months until the general election is called. I mean, really, I think, and it's a principal position I've said every time an MP defects, I think if you're elected under a party banner and you change what that party banner is, you should resign and force a by-election. That's the honourable thing to do, to check your constituents agree with your change of mood as well. But I think it's reflecting a wider disaffection with the Conservatives, and it's just another marker on the way of the descent of the Tory party, which are clearly going to get trounced in the local elections and trounced in the general election next.
I mean, he said, by the way, Dr. Dan Poulter, that the reason he hasn't resigned, and I take your point, and I think a lot of people share that sentiment, that if you change parties, then really you ought to stand down, because most people, in all honesty, vote on the basis of a party, and MPs,
They do, yeah.
MPs tend to inflate their egos and think that their own candidacy is what won it, but actually the effect of the candidate is normally fairly minimal, unless they're incredibly high-profile MPs. He's saying, though, Dr. Dan Poulter, just to put his side across, that he thinks because an election is going to be generally fairly imminent, it would be less disruptive to his constituents if he cracked on with casework in the meantime and didn't spark a by-election. What impact do you think this will have, though, Andrew, on Rishi Sunak? Because we've got the local elections as well this week. And I appreciate, you advise Labour. You're not necessarily listening to grumblings within the Conservative Party on WhatsApp groups and things this evening. But do you think that this could be a tipping point for Rishi Sunak now, defection and awful local election results in 1 week?
No, I don't think so. I think everyone knows that the Conservatives are going to lose the next election, and the reason that Rishi Sunak hasn't been removed is because there's no one better to replace him in the Conservative Party. That's the problem they've got, and that's not because I think Rishi Sunak's good. It's because the rest of them are all terrible as well. You look at the polling that's been done, public polling that's been done on this. Nobody does significantly better. It's perhaps a percentage point or something. It's all within the margin of error. People just want the Conservatives out. They're done, and that's the problem that faces them. And I think that's why people know it's going to be a terrible set of election results next week, because these were last contested in 2021, before Partygate, before Liz Truss, when the Conservatives actually had a lead in the polls. So these are going to be terrible results. Everyone knows that. Everyone's anticipating it. It won't really tell us any more than we already see in the polls and from the by-elections recently. The Conservatives are losing the next election, and given the state of the country, they deserve to.
OK, Andrew, thank you for your time this evening. Really interesting to get your perspective. That was Andrew Fisher there, who was an advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, so well plugged into politics, even if he is on a different side of the political spectrum to Rishi Sunak. Interesting to get his perspective on what this will mean. Do you think this spells the end for Rishi Sunak? Andrew thinks actually it doesn't make a huge amount of difference because of what's called expectation management in Westminster, the fact that people already expect Rishi Sunak to lose the next election. They already expect him to have dreadful local elections on Thursday. So what's the point, quite frankly, of getting rid of him now? Would it make any difference before a general election? I do think there is a point here about whether minds have already been made up before that general election. We won't know for sure, of course, until the polls open, whenever that may be. But will anything really alter the equation at this stage? Is there a leader out there who would make you more likely to vote Conservative than Rishi Sunak? Is there any point in the Conservatives changing leader? What impact do you think today's defection of Dr. Dan Poulter will have on Rishi Sunak? 0345 6060 973. A couple of texts coming in already. This person hasn't left their name. This person says, Keir says this is a symbol that Labour is a changed party. My immediate thought, though, is yes, but changed into what, Keir? Which I think was also Andrew's point there, that Keir Starmer's keen to emphasise that the party has changed from its time under Jeremy Corbyn, but what does it stand for now? That's still something I think that they're struggling to define at the moment. And Chris has texted in to say, hi Paul, I hope people out there, if they're dissatisfied with how the government has run local councils and blame councils and attacked the sick and disabled and then brought in voter ID for no reason, go out and actually vote in the next election. What do you think of the fact that Dr. Dan Poulter has defected from the Conservative Party to the Labour Party? Just a reminder of what he said this evening. He's given a couple of interviews, one to the BBC, one to the Observer newspaper. In the Observer newspaper, he says, I could not go on. I have to be able to look my NHS colleagues in the eye, my patients in the eye, and my constituents in the eye. And I know that the Conservative government has been failing on the thing I care about most, which is the NHS and its patients. Just to remind you, he's an NHS doctor. He works part-time as a mental health doctor in an NHS hospital. And he said that after more than 20 night shifts over the last year in a severely overstretched accident and emergency department, he felt that was truly life-changing, and it persuaded him to defect to the only party he believes was now really committed to investing in improving the NHS, according to the Observer. I think the fact that he is perceived as one of the last sort of centrist Conservative MPs in the party is also significant. This does suggest again that the party is drifting to the right. In fact, Dr. Dan Poulter says that it's now become a nationalist party of the right. It does feel as if the One Nation Tories, as they're known, are now a dwindling species within the Conservative Party. And defections like this, MPs of that wing of the party standing down, all it does is make it more likely that if the Conservatives do lose the next election, as we suspect, that whoever then becomes the leader after the election will be from the right of the party, because the only MPs left in the Conservative Party, quite possibly after the next election, are going to be on the right of the party and more likely to choose a leader who is even more right-wing than Rishi Sunak on issues like immigration, for example, on issues like benefits, which is another thing that Rishi Sunak has been announcing crackdowns on recently. So even if this doesn't change the outcome of the next election, it will have a dynamic when it comes to who takes over the Conservative Party after the next election and which direction that Conservative Party moves in. It does tend to be centrist Conservative MPs who are deserting the party at this point, a bit like the mirror image of what happened under Jeremy Corbyn. Do you remember when centrist Labour MPs were leaving or defecting to, what was it, Change UK? It had several names, didn't it? But remember when there were all those defections from Labour? And that changed the nature and the look of the party and the manifesto of the party going into the next election in 2019. So although this may not change the outcome of this coming general election, it will change the dynamics of the Conservative Party potentially. It's another step in that direction. What significance do you think this holds for Rishi Sunak, particularly in a week when we're expecting local elections?
Well, I think we have to regard it as a straw in the wind. This is the kind of thing that happens when a government's coming towards the end of its life and when it looks as though that it doesn't have much life beyond the forthcoming election. Of course, we have to bear in mind that Mr. Poulter is somebody who had already decided he wasn't going to stand at the next election, so he hasn't got much to lose. He is also somebody who does have a job to look forward to after the next election because he's remained a practicing doctor. But of course, it's perhaps because he's been a practicing doctor and therefore is particularly sensitive to how people in the National Health Service feel it's been run in recent years. And of course, we are looking at a health service which, true, waiting times are now beginning to go down, but it's still a health service that is suffering from record waiting times. And some people feel, rightly or wrongly, that the government, well, of course, much is to do with the pandemic, that the government also bears some responsibility in not turning things around more quickly, not least perhaps because of the way in which they handled the various doctor strikes. So he's particularly, therefore, sensitive to an issue, but it's an issue that it matters to the wider public. It's one of the things that's undoubtedly pushing the Conservative vote down.
I wondered about that. I wondered about that, Sir John, because
we should be careful about how much we read beyond this.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I just wondered whether that dynamic's quite interesting there that you talk about in terms of the issues people care about away from the parliamentary arithmetic and who sits on which side. It gives Labour an opportunity now to seize upon the salience of the NHS in the forthcoming general election, doesn't it? Because we've had a whole week. Pretty much mostly talking about immigration, which Rishi Sunak thinks is one of his stronger suits, even though it's actually a very tricky topic for him. But this allows Labour to move the conversation away from immigration, which can be difficult for Labour at times, and back to the ground of the NHS, which tends to be very safe Labour ground.
Sure. I mean, immigration isn't traditionally Labour's topic, and for the most part, Labour's criticism of the Conservatives on immigration, their Rwanda policy, has been at least as much about its presumed operational effectiveness, or in Labour's case, it's presumed ineffectiveness, as opposed to the principle. Although, in fairness to Labour, I think it's pretty clear they don't believe in the principle either. I mean, I think we should perhaps remark, Paul, that the 1 or 2 polls that have come out since the passage of the Rwanda bill, no consistent change in Conservative support. And some of us have been saying for quite a while, it doesn't look as though immigration is likely to be the game changer. Now, of course, the real test will be if and when the flights actually get off. But you're right, certainly, between now and next Thursday, Labour will be able to talk about a topic that is definitely its home territory, and will be able to argue, well, look, if a Conservative MP working in the health service thinks that he can no longer defend the government's record on the health service, why you therefore shouldn't believe the government. And that certainly over the next day or two, and of course it is local elections in England and Wales on Thursday, does just make life a bit more difficult for the Conservatives, just when last week they had got the Rwanda bill through, and of course also north of the border, at least they've been harrying the SNP.
Yeah, and it does feel as though the stars are aligning for Labour, because I was going to ask you about north of the border as well. South of the border, they got Rishi Sunak now in a flap over Dan Poulter. North of the border, they got Humza Yousaf facing a vote of no confidence this week, even though the charge there has been led by the Scottish Conservatives, I think, first and foremost. Nevertheless, the SNP's difficulties benefit Labour again, don't they?
Yes, potentially they do, in that certainly it's very, very clear that Labour are the party that is keen on precipitating things such that we do actually end up with an early Scottish election before the general election, because they've put down a motion that would potentially precipitate that more directly than the Conservative motion. And they've been very open. We now think there needs to be an election in Scotland, and that is an indication of their confidence, not just about their prospects for Westminster north of the border, but even their prospects for a Scottish Parliament election. And you can, the polling gives them every good reason to take their stance. I mean, I think probably, however, the reality, Paul, so far as Mr. Yousaf's future is concerned, he's probably going to survive the votes. It's going to be very difficult for Ash Regan to vote against him, because she'd be out on our ear, most likely, if there were to be an early Scottish election. I think the crucial question is, what do SNP MSPs say to the SNP chief whip at Holyrood in the next days and weeks? Well, as we all know, leaders in office, and we've seen it happen twice at Westminster in recent years, leaders in office don't lose because of formal votes. They lose because it becomes evident that they've lost the confidence of their colleagues. And I think the real question now is whether or not Mr. Yousaf is at risk of losing the confidence of his parliamentary colleagues.
Yeah, nothing drains your authority's leader quite like a confidence vote, even if you win it.